Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 557. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Lanslone, and today is March 14th, 2024. I got a lot of news to cover on today's show. I filled in for Dave DeCamp on Wednesday this week at antiwar.com writing news, so I have a bunch of my own stories to try to get through on today's show, and I will have a bonus episode out later in the week to really round out the news, because I had to skip a couple stories today just because we have really so much in the stat today. So everybody, please share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Of course, you can find the video version of the show on YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, and of course, it's out anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And the best way to follow me to keep up with all my work is on Twitter. I'm at Kyle _. All the shows, all the articles that I write, pretty much any article that gets published on antiwar.com, Libertarian Institute, I like to put it out on my Twitter feed. So follow that and check that out there. And thank you all so much. Let's get into the show today. First article is one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on March 13th. Maryland lawmaker attempts to stonewall bill to block deployment of National Guard in undeclared war. A bill in the Maryland state legislature that would block the deployment of the state's National Guard to overseas conflicts unless Congress has declared a war is being blocked by a committee chairwoman preventing the vote. One guardsman is arguing that the bill, Defend the Guard, needs to move forward urgently as the Maryland Guard is set to deploy to the Middle East. In an exchange on X, Delegate Jocelyn Pian Malik, who chairs the committee overseeing the bill, said she would not allow it to come up for a vote. She said, "Federal law allows National Guard to be called into federal active duty domestically and overseas. According to the Attorney General's office, the General Assembly is preempted from prohibiting such. They state that HB 220 is unconstitutional, and HB 220 is the Defend the Guard bill in Maryland." One of her colleagues, Robin Grammer, fired back that the law only restricts deployments to unconstitutional wars. He posted, "I'm also aware that the AG thinks, the Attorney General thinks it is constitutional to criminalize carry rights on every single private property in the state. His opinion was so bad that he got enjoined by a liberal court. We must obey the Constitution, which limits the deployment of deployments to constitutional declarations." Dan McKnight, who leads a group that champions Defend the Guard nationwide, said the chairwoman was ignoring the opinions of veterans. He said in a statement to the Institute, "The immense outpouring of support for HB 220 during the hearings demonstrates the popularity among Marylanders, particularly veterans. The chairwoman is refusing to bring the bill forward for an on-the-record vote. The legality of this bill is as clear and straightforward as the language in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution." One of those veterans is Maryland Guardsman Scott Spaulding, a Baltimore County teacher and a Purple Heart veteran. He had served in the Iraq War. He's actually done some interviews with our friend Patrick McFarland about his service, if anybody's interested in more of what Scott has to say. He's a really great guy. I'm a big fan of Scott. He expressed his frustration at the legislative inaction as some of his fellow guardsmen are preparing to deploy to the Middle East. And let me tell you, Scott is not very happy about this. In a statement to the Institute, he said, "The General Assembly had an opportunity in the last 3 years to pass Defend the Guard. I warned them that inaction would result in Maryland's Guard being sent to be killed or kill. Now Maryland's Guard's A-10 attack aircraft are going to active conflict during the holy month of Ramadan. I will have to explain to my Maryland high schoolers from Yemen, Iraq, and Syria why their new state is bombing their home country." In January, 3 members of the Georgia National Reserve were killed in a drone strike in Jordan near the border with Syria, and members of the Arizona National Guard were also injured in the attack. The Pentagon regularly deploys members of state National Guards to war zones, even if Congress has not authorized the war. McKnight believes Defend the Guard can help to rein in the executive fighting endless and undeclared wars without congressional oversight, his group, Bring Our Troops Home, has worked to advance the legislation in several states. And if anybody's interested in helping out, they're always looking for volunteers, people to phone bank and stuff like that. We actually have more updates on Defend the Guard. This one from Dave DeCamp. He writes, this week, a committee in Idaho's House of Representatives will take up the Defend the Guard Act legislation that will prohibit the state's National Guard from being deployed to combat zones without formal declaration of war from Congress. Idaho's Senate has already passed a Defend the Guard bill, making it the third state legislator in the country to approve a version of the legislation. The Idaho House Transportation Defense Committee is expected to vote on the bill this Friday. And, Bring Our Troops Home posted on X. The last hill to climb in Idaho is the House Transportation and Defense Committee. And so I guess, if they get this, they think they're going to have a real chance to get this passed in Idaho. And, all the best to these guys. They're doing absolutely great work. Great work. All right, next up here. White House lobbies against ban on purchase of Americans' data. So I wrote this one for the Institute on March 11th. For years, several federal agencies have been spending U.S. tax dollars to buy Americans' data from private bulk sellers. As some members of Congress seek a new law against the practice, the Joe Biden administration is pushing back against the effort to curtail the power to buy the information that would otherwise require a warrant. U.S. intelligence, military, and law enforcement agencies have gathered a massive amount of Americans' data through private brokers. Michael Morrell, the former head of the CIA, admitted to the Wall Street Journal last year, if we collected it using traditional methods, it would be top sensitive and you would have to put it in a database. You'd want you keep it in a safe. A bipartisan group of lawmakers teamed up to stop the unconstitutional method of collecting massive amounts of Americans' information. Representatives Jim Jordan and Andy Biggs, they're both Republicans from Ohio and Arizona, teamed up with Ron Wyden and Representative Jayapal. I think they're both Democrats from Washington State, and one's a senator and one's a representative, placed a provision in a bill that would prohibit the government from buying Americans' information, although it would allow for the collection of data on foreign nationals. And so, of course, there you always have once they're collecting data on foreign nationals, they're going to be collecting data on the Americans in contact with those foreign nationals. And so suddenly you're collecting data on a lot of Americans very quickly anyways, but this is still a step in the right direction. And of course, if you try to prevent the U.S. government from having to follow the Constitution, particularly the Fourth Amendment, and to get a warrant for any data they want, they're going to have an absolute panic attack and claim it's going to allow all these terrorists. So this is a small practical bite out of the massive data problem that, our government's collecting our data and could use it against us that we have. And so this would be a step in the right direction, a small first step, but certainly a step in the right direction, but it is being opposed by the White House. So one of the reasons this is so threatening is last year, a report released by the Director of National Intelligence warned the data could be used to reveal sensitive and intimate information about personal attributes, private behavior, social connections, and speech of U.S. persons and non-U.S. persons. It can be misused to pry into the private lives, ruin reputations, and cause emotional distress and threaten the safety of individuals. The report continues, even subject to appropriate controls, the data can increase the power of the government's ability to peer into private lives that may exceed our constitutional traditions and other social expectations. And, at the time, what they're really talking about and what the CIA and some of these intelligence agencies are able to do is when they buy this data from Facebook. So say, Facebook sells your data, T-Mobile sells your whoever, right? They may say, oh, we're not selling your personal information. We're selling all this bulk information. And it doesn't say Kyle Anslone's data. It says user X3475 data, right? Like it's anonymous the way they send it. But what the intelligence community say is that they have collected so much of this data at this point that by plugging in the fact that my phone was at this certain location for X number of hours a day. And a couple other pieces of information that they could figure out who, user whatever number is, and unmask essentially anybody through this method. So despite the alarming potential for abuse, the White House opposes a congressional effort to rein in the collection of Americans' data. President Biden, who recently signed an executive order banning some foreign governments from buying American data, is well aware of this potential. During a congressional hearing last month, a White House official claimed the U.S. government uses the data differently than other nations, urging lawmakers not to curtail the practice. "I would not compare the way that our government uses data to the way that countries of concern are using the data," the official claimed. Biden ally, Representative Jim Himes, a Democrat from Connecticut, asserted that the ban would undermine some of the most fundamental and important activities of the U.S. intelligence community and law enforcement. However, according to the Wall Street Journal, the intelligence community has used this data to pursue far more trivial crimes, such as credit card fraud and tracking down illegal immigrants. And look, I know both of those things. There's people who are supportive of, certainly credit card fraud. For the most part, I think people are probably fairly supportive of, the government prosecuting that crime. Tracking down illegal immigrants, I'm not sure what percentage of Americans would support it, but if they're willing to use this data to track down illegal immigrants, I think they're going to be willing to use this data to track down just about anybody that they don't like. And so if you're any kind of dissenter to the state, I would be very concerned about all of this. Now, next up here, some more very concerning legislation kind of around the censorship realm. House passes Biden-supported bill that could ban TikTok. So the House passed a bill that will allow the president to ban TikTok without an ownership change. Opponents of the legislation warn that it will give the executive a massive amount of power to control the online discourse. The bill now heads to the Senate. President Joe Biden says he will send it if it reaches his desk. What they call Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversaries Controlled Applications Act, which, when a bill has a name like that, what's inside is going to be absolutely nefarious and disgusting. And of course, this is bipartisan, which is another indication it's going to be extremely nefarious and erode the rights of Americans. So it was introduced by Representative Mike Gallagher and Democrat Raja, I'm not going to try to say his last name, and it would order TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to divest its shares from the company within 6 months or face an effective ban in the U.S. The bill passed the House 352 to 65. The opposition was 15 Republicans and 50 Democrats. The bill had bipartisan support, with 197 Republicans and 155 Democrats voting for it. Proponents of the bill, such as Representative Elise Stefanik, argue that Beijing uses TikTok to influence Americans. The New York Congresswoman said she co-sponsored the app because TikTok's attempt to mobilize young Americans on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this is all ridiculous. There's no evidence for this, but if you watched, and I watched, I would say like 4 or 5 of the proponents of this bill give their testimony, including Mike Gallagher and Nancy Pelosi, and none of them had anything actually substantial to say. It was all fear-mongering around the China issue of, how much control China has over these platforms, and Pelosi said that this was going to make it better somehow, which anybody who's experienced the online social media community pre and post 2015, 2016 understands that the U.S. government having more control over what gets said and posted online is going to make it worse, not better. So critics of the bill argue that it was rushed and will grant the president too much power. The bill was reportedly drafted with technical support from the administration staffers and passed through the House Energy and Commerce Committee unanimously last Thursday with bipartisan backing. Florida Republican Matt Gaetz posted on X, banning TikTok is the right idea, but this legislation was overly broad and rushed and unavailable for amendment or revision. This is no way to run a railroad or the internet. And so Gates's statement was a little bit disappointing because he shouldn't be for the ban of TikTok at all, but at least he identifies that there's some problems. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who also voted against the bill, explained there was constitutional concerns. Not only are there First Amendment concerns, this is bad policy, she said to explain her vote against the bill. Representative Thomas Massie, he's a Republican from Kentucky, slammed the bill as what he called a Trojan horse for censorship. He points to sections of the legislation that allow the president to ban websites. He posted on X, the president will be given the power to ban websites, not just apps. The person breaking the law is deemed to be the U.S. or offshore internet hosting services or app stores, not the foreign adversary. And so, I think this is going to be a potential for a lot of censorship, particularly of the independent media. So if this does pass, I would be very concerned. According to a press release put out by Representative Gallagher's House Subcommittee on China, the law, quote, establishes a process for the president to designate other foreign adversaries controlled social media applications as defined by the statute that shall face prohibition on the App Store availability and access to web hosting services in the United States unless they sever ties with the foreign adversary controlled company. And so I think what they're going to say is something like, if there's an independent media site they don't like, they're going to say, oh, you're tied to Russia, China, Hamas, whoever they don't like, and they're going to try to get your content taken down that way. Very, very concerning here. The president, the press release adds, the president may exercise this authority if the application presents national security threat, has over 1 million active users, and is under the control of a foreign adversary entity as defined by the statute. And the problem is they're going to claim that everyone is controlled by a foreign entity who's saying things they don't like. The bill now heads to the Senate. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did not commit to bringing the legislation to a floor vote. Now, interesting, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, says he plans to pressure Chuck Schumer to get him to bring this vote to the floor. And so I almost wonder if the Democrats in the Senate will push Johnson to allow a vote on the massive $95 billion military bill in order to get him to have this vote in the Senate. If it does pass the Senate, Biden pledged to sign the bill into law. It may also just take a phone call from President Biden to get Chuck Schumer to go ahead and allow this vote. And I think there's a very low chance that it won't pass, given how much it passed in the House and how everybody in Congress is looking at this as an anti-China issue. Now, one thing a lot of people are pointing out that I do think is very important that I didn't include in my article is that if you look at a lot of the content that is being shared on TikTok right now, this is mostly among young Americans, and people always say, oh, millennials use TikTok. From my experience as a millennial, I think on the older half of the millennial spectrum, and not many of my friends really use TikTok. A few of them do, but generally speaking, people are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, things like that in my generation. From my experience, the TikTok following is members of the next generation, Generation X. However, several of these, maybe even half of them now are of voting age. And so they are looking and paying attention to what's going on. And what they're really paying attention to is the war in Gaza and the Israeli slaughter of the Palestinians there. And we have seen that this is a massive problem for the president. And so censoring TikTok right now would probably be a boon for the Biden campaign, because some of his most hardcore supporters are going to stop seeing videos every day of the genocide that the U.S. is supporting in Gaza. All right, next up here, House Democrats will attempt to force vote on $95 billion war bill. The top Democrat on the House Rules Committee is attempting to employ a rarely used rule to force a vote on a massive military spending bill that includes $61 billion for Ukraine and $14 billion for Israel. A significant number of Americans oppose sending billions to Israel or Ukraine. Representative Jim McGovern, he's the ranking Democrat of the House Rules Panel, is collecting signatures to force a vote on the supplemental defense spending bill. McGovern will need a majority of representatives, or at least 218, to sign his petition to bring the bill to a vote, even if Speaker Mike Johnson opposes it. The bill has passed the Senate, and President Joe Biden has said he will sign it into law should it clear the lower chamber. Members of the House estimate that the $95 billion war bill will easily pass the body with over 300 votes if Johnson allows it to come to the floor. Though Johnson supports the spending to become speaker, he pledged to block any vote on Ukraine without sufficient immigration reform. The $95 billion legislation does not include money for border enforcement. The bill is moving through Congress at a precarious time for Tel Aviv and Kiev. In Ukraine, Kiev's forces are losing ground to Russian fighters, while Ukrainian soldiers report a severe lack of ammunition and manpower. There is little hope on the horizon for Kiev, as Russia is producing substantially more weapons than Ukraine's Western backers. Tel Aviv is struggling in the north and south. In Gaza, Israeli forces have slaughtered over 20,000 women and children, but have made little inroads in dismantling Hamas. On the northern border, Tel Aviv is in a fight with Hezbollah, forcing multiple Israeli villages to evacuate towards the center of the country. Additionally, the war in Gaza has become increasingly unpopular in the U.S. Many Americans, including a sizable portion of Biden's Democratic base, view the Israeli onslaught as a genocide. Protesters has disrupted several of the president's re-election campaign events this year with chants of Genocide Joe, and the administration has taken some pretty severe steps to try to cut those. All right, next up here, Biden requests $895 billion for military spending for 2025. President Biden has requested a record $895 billion in military spending for the 2025 fiscal year. Of that, about $850 billion will go to the Pentagon, and the remaining funds will go to U.S. federal agencies for military programs, including the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons program. While a massive figure, the request would likely have been higher if it's not for the debt ceiling deal reached between House Republicans and the White House last year, which capped military spending for 2024 and 2025. The $895 billion is a 1% increase over the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, which still hasn't been appropriated by Congress. The debt ceiling deal did not cap energy supplemental military spending, which is how the U.S. has been funding the proxy war in Ukraine. President Biden is also urging the House to pass $95 billion supplemental foreign military aid bill that includes funding for Ukraine, Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, and Taiwan, factoring in other costs, including veteran affairs budget and interest paid in national security related debt. The true cost of military spending in 2025 will easily exceed $1.5 trillion. So, and one more thing I want to add in here. When the White House proposes this budget, one of the things they like to do is take things out of the Pentagon budget that they know Congress wants in there. And so this year they are only ordering one new attack submarine instead of two, as they usually do. Now, the reason that this is important is because what typically happens is Congress will approve the bill and then later on decide either to supplement. And so I guess that's the way they would just add it in during the NDAA debate, and then they would, have another attack submarine plus everything else the Pentagon wanted. But this year, with the cap on the NDAA at $895, my guess is what will happen is Congress will end up passing another supplemental bill that has funding for some of the things that didn't make it into the NDAA. So just a way for Congress to do an end run around any budget caps. All right, next up here is one about Haiti, where Prime Minister Ariel Henry has agreed to resign. This from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, March 12th. Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry has announced he will step down and make way for a transitional government nearly 2 years after assuming power in the wake of the assassination of Jovenel Moïse. The move comes as the Caribbean nation is gripped by violent unrest, with armed groups seizing areas of the capital city and clashing with local security forces. Speaking from Puerto Rico, where he has been stranded for days thanks to the chaos in Port-au-Prince, Henry unveiled the decision late on Monday night, saying he would step down immediately after the appointment of a transitional council. For more than a week, our country has experienced increased acts of violence of all kinds perpetrated against the population, assassinations, attacks against law enforcement, looting, systematic destruction of public and private buildings. Henry said in a video statement, asking all Haitians to remain calm and do everything they can for peace and stability to come back as soon as possible. The agreement was announced following a meeting between the Caribbean community, that's CARICOM, leaders and U.S. officials in Jamaica, with the Guyanese president Ali saying it would allow for a peaceful transition of power, continuity of government, an action plan for near-term security, and the road to a free and fair elections. The Transitional Council will be made up of 9 current and former Haitian officials and other civil society leaders, though will reportedly exclude those under indictment with past criminal convictions or those who have been penalized by the United Nations under sanctions. Those seeking to run in Haiti's next election who oppose the UN-backed multinational security mission to Haiti will also be disqualified, according to the Washington Post. And that seems to be the biggest problem for me, is that, they're really cementing that this is still our vision that Haiti will have to conform with, that the Haitian peoples will have to conform with. We're not letting Haiti decide their own future still. So CARICOM leaders did not provide any timeline for the creation of a new council or the country's next elections, leaving Haiti's government virtually crippled after lawmakers' terms expired last year. Though Haiti previously agreed to a transition in new elections, the process has been repeatedly delayed. Months of unrest across Port-au-Prince has seen armed factions seize swaths of the city, engage in turf wars with rival militias, and clash with government forces, while some groups have demanded Henry's immediate resignation. While Haitians will have to decide who is going to be the head of their country and what will be the model of government we want, said militant leader Jimmy Barbecue, a former national police officer who has vowed to overthrow Henry. We are also going to figure out to get Haiti out of the misery it is in now. After multiple requests for an international force to help restore order, Haiti struck an agreement with Kenya to lead a security mission earlier this month, and this was done by the U.S. and through the UN Security Council. The U.S. has pledged over $300 million to help deal with this. Of course, UN peacekeepers have a pretty dark legacy in Haiti, raping a lot of women the last time they were there, and then causing a cholera outbreak that killed nearly 10,000. So absolutely horrific, their legacy in that country. And it's no wonder why Haitians are even willing to rally around some of these militant leaders in their country versus having outside militants from Kenya come. U.S. sending Ukraine more cluster bombs as part of new $300 million arms package. This one from Dade to Camp on March 12th. The White House has announced on Tuesday that the U.S. is sending a new $300 million arms package to Ukraine that includes cluster bombs, which are notorious for killing and maiming civilians. The arms package is the first for Ukraine to be announced since December 27th, as the Pentagon said it's out of money to replenish the weapons that have been used to Ukraine, and Congress still hasn't authorized more. U.S. officials claim the new weapons package is being paid for using savings in the U.S. Army budget. While the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan announced the package and said it was assistance that the Ukraine desperately needs to hold the line against Russian attacks and to push back against the continuing Russian onslaught in the east and in other parts of Ukraine, Sullivan also pleaded with Congress to approve the $60 billion Biden is seeking to fuel the proxy war for another year. We have said repeatedly here in the briefing room, and President Biden said to the entire nation at the State of the Union last week, that we cannot provide ongoing assistance to Ukraine without significantly impacting our military readiness absent congressional action. And so this is all interesting because we just had that report from Politico that the US has already sent Ukraine 10 billion more weapons than we could actually replace in our own stockpiles. And, we've talked about this accounting a lot on the show and how it's all problematic. But what the US government is doing here is very concerning. You can't just take money from one thing and apply it to a war that Congress hasn't authorized funding for. I mean, that's what Congress is supposed to do, but we're well past the Constitution meaning pretty much anything at this point. All right, next up, another one from our friend Will Porter. Russia producing 3 times more shells than U.S., Europe combined. Russia's defense industry is churning out nearly 3 times more artillery shells than its American and European counterparts, according to a NATO intelligence report obtained by CNN. Western powers have scrambled to ramp up production as Ukraine has faced dire ammunition shortages. While the US and Europe had the capacity to produce a combined 1.2 million shells annually, Russia's output has now reached nearly 3 million, the NATO estimate said. Though Washington aims to boost that production to 100,000 shells each month by 2025, up from just 28,000 last September, that target would only be met with the resumption of American aid to Kiev and would still put the U.S. output at less than half of Moscow's. According to U.S. officials, Russia is burning through roughly 10,000 shells per day, vastly outgunning the Ukrainians, who are firing just 2,000. The Estonian defense minister has estimated that Kiev would need another 200,000 rounds every month to match Russia's firepower. The European Union has also raised to step up shell production to help close the gap, pledging last year to provide 1 million shells by March. However, the bloc later acknowledged that would fall short of the goal by half, estimating that would produce just a little over 500,000 shells. Though Europe's production capacity has lagged behind Ukraine's needs, a group of Western states have reportedly agreed to purchase 800,000 shells that could be delivered within weeks, according to Bloomberg. The Czech Republic would act as the middleman in the deal, while Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Netherlands are all expected to foot the bill. The persistent ammunition shortages likely helped to explain the recent battlefield setbacks for Ukraine, including the withdrawal from the key Donbas city of Avdiivka, as well as the lackluster summer counteroffensives, which failed to make significant gains. Though the U.S. has supplied Kiev with more than 2 million 155mm rounds and a vast array of other munitions since 2022, American military assistance has largely dried up thanks to congressional gridlock over the latest aid bill. Parts of the larger spending package that would supply arms to Israel and and other U.S. partners, include $60 billion for Ukraine, remains blocked by House Republicans, who have demanded reforms to U.S. border policy before approving additional aid. And this is also unpopular with Americans. The Pentagon announced that it had run out of money for Ukraine last December, while a senior defense official recently told Politico that the U.S. is already $10 billion in the hole and unable to backfill the U.S. stockpiles unless a new aid bill is passed. All right, next up, an article I wrote for the antiwar.com on March 13th. And keep that last article in mind as I'm talking about this one. U.S. rejects Russian ceasefire proposal for Ukraine. Russia attempted to broker a ceasefire in Ukraine along the current lines of control and was met with a firm rejection by Washington. U.S. officials reiterated their stance, stating that they would only engage in talks with Moscow with Kiev's consent. According to Reuters, in late 2023 and early 2024, Russian intermediaries reached out to U.S. officials seeking to establish a ceasefire. The Kremlin was hoping to freeze the fighting along the current lines of control. The contact with Americans came to nothing, an unnamed senior Russian official told the outlet. Russian officials said some progress was made, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan agreed to a call with his counterpart in the Kremlin. Putin's advisor suggested the ceasefire to Sullivan, but Sullivan refused to talk with him about Ukraine. Putin has also suggested during public remarks about talks, including in his interview with Tucker Carlson. U.S. officials speaking with Reuters said there was no formal contact with Russian negotiators and stressed that Washington would not engage in talks with Moscow without Kiev. However, some admitted that Russian officials have floated the talks in an unofficial manner. The Joe Biden administration has steadfastly refused to engage in talks with the Kremlin. Before the war in Ukraine broke out, Moscow sent Washington the outlines of a deal to prevent the war, and a Biden administration staffer later acknowledged that the White House refused to negotiate with Russia on Putin's top issues, including NATO's military buildup in Eastern Europe and the alliance expansion to Ukraine. During the first 2 months of the war, Moscow and Kiev engaged in talks hosted by U.S. allies Turkey and Israel. Russian, Ukrainian, Turkish, and Israeli officials have all confirmed that the deal was nearly reached. However, the U.S. and U.K. pushed Ukrainian President Zelensky to forego the deal with Putin. Washington's current refusal to talk with Moscow comes as the war is going poorly for Kiev, with Ukrainian forces losing significant territory to Russia in recent months. Additionally, Kiev lacks the manpower and ammunition to mount an effective defense. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines told Congress on Monday that Ukraine's military weaknesses have been exposed. Ukraine's retreat from Avdiivka and their struggle to stave off further territorial losses in the past 2 weeks have exposed the erosion of Ukraine's military capabilities with the declining availability of external military aid. While CIA Director William Burns also issued a dire warning to Congress, saying the Ukrainians are not running out of courage and tenacity, they're running out of ammunition, and we're running out of time to help them. So this does not seem to be going well. All right, now we're going to get into the news about Gaza, and we have a lot of bad news here. Israel to move civilians to, quote, humanitarian islands before invasion of Rafah. All right, so I wrote this for the antiwar.com on March 13th. The Israeli military announced its plans to relocate 1.5 million Palestinians taking refuge in Rafah to what they call humanitarian islands. Tel Aviv said it was planning to attack Rafah. The White House urged Israel to develop a strategy for evacuating the civilians first. So the Israeli military spokesperson said the Palestinians will be relocated to other areas of Gaza. He told reporters, "We need to make sure that the 1.4 million people, or at least a significant amount of the 1.4 million, will move where to humanitarian islands that we will create with the international community." And he uses the 1.4 figure. My guess is that the number is actually over the 1.5 number. That has been used for about a month now, and that number was figured when there was still a significant number of people in Khan Yunis, and a lot of those people have been pushed into Rafah. So, several top U.S. officials have stated that before attacking Rafah, Israel must have plans for the Palestinian sheltering in the city, and it is the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip. The White House issued similar demands before Tel Aviv commenced attacks on other cities in the Strip, such as Khan Yunis. Israel has responded by issuing Palestinians convoluted instructions on where to evacuate. Additionally, the communications blackout in Gaza caused by the Israeli war makes obtaining accurate information difficult for the hundreds of thousands of war-weary residents and refugees. Israeli forces have repeatedly attacked regions deemed safe zones, as well as civilians traveling along paths that were marked as evacuation routes by Israel. The Israeli military spokesperson claimed Palestinians would find food and shelter provided by international aid organizations in the humanitarian islands. However, those who have fled to other safe zones have reported a lack of aid in other facilities. The military spokesperson did not say when the evacuations or the assault on Rafah would begin. Rafah is the last city in the Gaza Strip not decimated by the 5-month-long Israeli onslaught, which has destroyed most of the infrastructure in the Strip and killed more than 31,000 people. Combined with the bombardment, Israel is severely limiting aid shipments to Gaza, putting hundreds of thousands of Palestinians on the verge of famine. On Wednesday, Israel attacked a UN food distribution center, claiming to target a Hamas commander in Rafah. Martin Griffiths, the UN humanitarian chief, said the organizations are struggling to continue operating due to the Israeli attacks. How are we to maintain aid operations when our teams and supplies are constantly under threat? They must be protected. This war has to stop. So when you hear Israel saying they're going to set up these humanitarian islands that will have aid, you have to remember what Israel is doing to the aid shipments to know how big of a lie that is. So I wrote this one for the Institute on March 12th. Israel tightens grip on aid entering Gaza. The head of the UN aid organization for Palestinians, UNRWA, reported that Tel Aviv has rejected aid shipments for Gaza because the supplies, including children's scissors and other life-saving medications. Israel has used a multitude of tactics to reduce the flow of aid to a trickle, as top UN officials warn of an intentional famine in Gaza. On Monday, UNRWA chief Felipe Laranzare explained that the Israeli restrictions on Gaza are getting even more severe, to the point that children's scissors were rejected. A truckload with aid has just been turned back because the scissors used in the children's medical kit. He posted on X, medical scissors are now added to a long list of banned items authorities classify as dual use. And for anybody watching the video here, anybody who checked out my article on at the Libertarian Institute, I used a picture of the scissors that were apparently the cause of the concern, and you can see these are, short, maybe a few inches long, and they have like the rounded off tops like children's scissors. These clearly aren't something that, even if you grabbed the handle of them and tried, you couldn't stab somebody with these things. And of course, the reason these scissors are important is when you're doing a lot of like medical gauze and things like that, you got to cut the gauze or other medical devices and stuff. So I'm sure the doctors in Gaza really do need the scissors. Almost more problematic, of course, is that when they take off these scissors, it's not like they take the scissors and then send the rest of the truck through. The entire truck has to go back to the back of the inspection line. So aid groups have repeatedly condemned Tel Aviv's tight restrictions on aid, pointing to the policy of rejecting entire shipments even if one banned item is found. According to Laranzare, the list of prohibited goods includes basic life-saving items from anesthetics, solar lights, oxygen cylinders, and ventilators, to clean water cleaning tablets, cancer medications, and maternity kits. Aid shipments to the strip have plummeted from 500 to under 100 per day. Tel Aviv has deployed a series of bureaucratic and military obstacles to prevent aid from reaching the starving Palestinians. Israeli officials have blocked aid deliveries from being offloaded at the port, while government agencies continue to reject visas for international aid workers. Israeli citizens have also helped to block aid shipments by staging large protests at checkpoints, with the military standing by as demonstrators prevent the transit of life-saving aid. Additionally, the Israeli Defense Forces have attacked several aid shipments and the police that escort the convoys. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food told Mondo Weiss that the strip is now on the brink of famine, also noting that the official death toll of 31,000 is likely an undercount. We've never seen children pushed into malnutrition so quickly. This was all preventable. I have no doubt, and this again is in consultation with experts all over the world, we have no doubt that the horror, the numbers, the degree of hunger, the degree of death from malnutrition will be higher than we're able to measure right now. Last week, a group of 7 UN experts said the famine in Gaza was a deliberate Israeli policy of collective punishment. Israel has been intentionally starving Palestinian people in Gaza since October 7th. Now it is targeting civilians seeking humanitarian aid and humanitarian convoys. Israel must end its campaign of starvation and targeting of civilians, the UN experts said. While President Biden has repeatedly stated over months that he is pressuring Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to allow more assistance into Gaza, less aid has reached the strip. Rather than use Washington's substantial leverage over Tel Aviv to force Israel to reverse course, the White House has resorted to complicated and deadly methods of bringing small amount of aid into the strip. The U.S. and several other countries have used airdrops to get food to the Gazans. However, people on the ground report drops are often difficult to access, while a botched drop resulted in 5 people being crushed to death last Friday. During his State of the Union address, Biden declared the U.S. would establish a temporary pier, allowing aid to reach Gaza via a sea corridor. Tel Aviv says it will only permit the shipments if it has control over the process, all but ensuring Israel would continue its severe restrictions on life-saving medication, even if the military can build a functioning dock. So a little bit more on that port. This from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, March 12th. 4 Army vessels carrying about 100 American troops departed Virginia on Tuesday with equipment to build a temporary port on Gaza's coast, AFP reported. U.S. officials say the idea of the port is to get more aid into Gaza, where the entire population is facing food shortages and children are starving to death. President Biden is taking extreme measures instead of pressuring Israel to allow more aid into the Strip by cutting military assistance. And I think the real risk here is we end up with almost a similar situation to Kabul in 2021. And it could be maybe an IDF strike that kills a lot of Palestinians, including some American soldiers. It could be just a Palestinian who's very angry about the situation and tries to take revenge on the U.S. soldiers. There's a lot of people who are going to want to do harm to these U.S. soldiers. And rather than, again, just allowing the aid to flow through Gaza's several border crossings with Israel. I mean, it's a land border all the way around. They could open as basically as many of them as they want. The Biden administration is choosing this convoluted path. All right, next up here, Sullivan dismisses reports that says Biden is considering conditioning aid to Israel if it invades Rafah. And so this has been talked about for some time, that Biden has thrown out this idea that Rafah is a red line. And then I noticed something really interesting. After Biden said that there was a red line on attacking Rafah and that Israel can't kill another 30,000 Palestinian civilians, a reporter asked the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at a press conference, and I thought she did a pretty fair job of summarizing what Biden said, which is he issued these red lines but didn't say that he would cut off support. And Miller chastised her and said that is not what the president said, which on his part, and all he does is lie anyways, but that was a pretty big lie to tell, to call this journalist a liar to her face when she wasn't telling a lie at all. But it seemed to be a pretty clear denial from the Biden administration that they were not in any way issuing a red line on this. And Sullivan confirmed that. He said, "We're not going to engage in hypotheticals about what to come down the line, and this report that purport to describe the president's thinking are uninformed speculation." So he's responding to a report that said the Biden administration was considering conditioning military aid to Israel if it invades Rafah. Now, something that myself and Dave DeCamp talked about is, if you're going to start considering aid to Israel if it invades Rafah, once it invades Rafah, it's almost already too late to cut off that aid, because there's going to be, I'm sure, multiple rounds of debate in the U.S. and it's going to take a couple weeks. And by that time, Israel will have either destroyed most or all of Rafah anyways. All right, next up, this one I wrote for antiwar.com on March 13th. Senior Israeli officials suggest U.S. trying to overthrow Netanyahu. After a U.S. intelligence assessment concluded that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's rule is vulnerable, a senior Israeli official suggested Washington was attempting to overthrow the war government in Tel Aviv. President Joe Biden has grown increasingly critical of his longtime friend Netanyahu, while the White House has sought to distinguish between support for Israel and its leader. The administration says it will not reduce any support for Tel Aviv. A senior Israeli official slammed the Biden administration in remarks to the Jerusalem Post, saying, "We expect our friends to overthrow the terror regime of Hamas and not the elected government of Israel. Israeli citizens and not anyone else elect the prime minister. Israel is not a protectorate of the U.S., but an independent and democratic country whose citizens are the ones that choose the government." The statement followed the annual threat assessment compiled by U.S. intelligence agencies, which was released on Monday, and questioned Netanyahu's hold on power. It said Netanyahu's viability as a leader, as well as his governing coalition of far-right and ultra-Orthodox parties that pursued the hardline policies on Palestinian and security issues, may be in jeopardy. Distrust of Netanyahu's ability to rule deepens and broadens across the public from its already high levels before the war, and we expect large protests demanding his resignation and new elections. A different, more moderate government is possible. While Netanyahu may not be personally popular among Israelis, his policies are. The Atlantic Council reported Israelis reportedly show a historically low level of confidence in the prime minister, while support for his Likud party keeps dwindling. However, at the same time, it's also clear that the general public in Israel supports Netanyahu's policies. About 2/3 of the Jewish public do not support Israel agreeing in principle to an independent or even a demilitarized Palestinian state. As Biden has faced increased criticisms from Democrats over his unconditional support for Israel, the White House has attempted to distinguish support for Israel and Netanyahu. In the past week, Biden has criticized Netanyahu on several occasions, saying he wanted to have a come to Jesus meeting with the leader of the Jewish state. In an interview with MSNBC on Saturday, Biden accused Netanyahu of hurting Israel, while Axios report that the White House was becoming increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu's what they call ungratefulness. However, even if Netanyahu remains prime minister and violates Biden's red lines, the administration says it will not halt weapon transfers to Tel Aviv. And I really do think that this is mainly, if not all, propaganda here. The divide between Biden and Netanyahu. I'm not saying that this is maybe coordinated behind the scenes, that Biden and Netanyahu aren't having friendly conversations and saying like, okay, now I'm going to tell people on a hot mic that I'm going to have a come to Jesus meeting with you. Ha 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 ha. But I do think that the administration does understand that they have no plans whatsoever to cut off aid to Israel, but they think if they sound critical of Netanyahu, it will be enough to bring back some of the Democratic base that is outraged over Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza. All right, so next up here, Israel bombs food distribution center in Gaza, killing 5. The UNRWA food distribution center in Gaza was hit by an airstrike, killing 5. The bombing of the facility is the latest in a series of Israeli attacks on food distribution in Gaza. The Israeli military operations in Gaza and restriction on aid entering the strip has placed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians on the brink of starvation. Witnesses and Gazan health officials and the UN report that Israel attacked the UNRWA warehouse in Rafah on Wednesday, killing 5 people, including one UNRWA worker. Officials report that scores were injured in the attack without providing a number. The Israeli onslaught in Gaza has had a massive impact on aid workers. One Palestinian in Rafah said the attack was particularly concerning because UNRWA sites are generally considered safe. It's an UNRWA center expected to be secure, the resident said. Over the past 5 months, 165 aid workers have been killed and over 150 of the agency's buildings in Gaza have been hit. The attack on food distribution centers comes as famine is taking hold in Gaza. Over 24 people, mostly children, have starved to death in recent weeks. Israel has significantly reduced aid transfers to Gaza since hostilities flared last October. What little aid makes it to the strip has at times been attacked by Israeli forces. Earlier this month, Israeli forces opened fire on a crowd attempting to take food from an aid convoy of trucks, killing over 100 people. According to the Tel Aviv-based 972 magazine, Israeli forces regularly hit what they call power targets, such as public buildings, universities, banks, and government offices, to exert civilian pressure on Hamas. The practice is a form of collective punishment and a war crime. While numerous Israeli officials have publicly stated they intend to destroy all of Gaza and ethnically cleanse the 2.3 million Palestinians living in the strip, the White House largely refuses to condemn Israel's war crimes or limit the U.S. military support for Tel Aviv. Now, we've had a few more details emerge about this attack since I wrote the article. The Israeli military did admit that they hit the target. They said that there was a Hamas commander there. No evidence for that, of course. That's what they're going to say. Even if there was, you can't blow up a food warehouse because you think somebody you don't like is there. And this is something that is well established in international humanitarian law. All right, next up here, this is a particularly grim story that I wrote for the Institute. Israeli forces torture and humiliate detained medical staff. 3 Palestinian medical staffers released from Israeli captivity said they were severely abused and humiliated. Multiple Israeli outlets and human rights organizations have documented systemic abuse of Palestinians in detention, including torture, sex crimes, and mistreatment that results in death. Speaking with the BBC, the Palestinian medics said they were humiliated, beaten, doused with cold water, and forced to kneel in uncomfortable positions for hours and detained for days before being released. The outlet obtained footage of the initial detention of the medical staff at the Nasser hospital. The video showed the men stripped to their underwear with their doctor's gowns in front of them. Anyone who tried to move his head or make any movement got hit. One doctor explained they left them for around 2 hours in what the doctor described as the shameful position. An expert in humanitarian law described the incident as extremely concerning, saying it very clearly crosses into the category of cruel and inhumane treatment. While some of the released doctors were able to recount their torture, families of others say they have no information on their loved ones. The torture of Palestinian detainees at the hands of their captors has been well documented, including in Israeli military. This is from Haaretz. Detainees and prisoners at a prison in northern Israel have reported several cases of harsh abuse carried out by prison wardens, including guards kicking, punching, hitting their testicles, and humiliating prisoners. Some testified that a prisoner who was beaten died of his injuries. 972 reported Israeli soldiers subjected Palestinians to electric shots, burned their skins with lighters, spat in their mouth, and deprived them of sleep, food, and access to bathrooms until they defecated on themselves. Some testified to have been beaten all over their bodies, having cigarettes extinguished on their nets and bats. Several people are known to have died as a result of being held in these conditions, and Haaretz has reported that that number is at least 27. Last week, a report by the UN Palestinian aid agency, UNRWA, found Israeli soldiers had tortured its staff members to generate false confessions about being linked to Hamas, including the use of waterboarding. And we've talked about how these false confessions led to the UNRWA aid being cut by multiple countries. Antony Blinken calling those claims highly, highly credible. That, again, came from waterboarding. Absolutely disgusting. When asked by the BBC about the allegations of abusing Palestinians' doctors, the IDF declined to comment. Additionally, the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller declined to condemn the mistreatment or say there would be any consequences for Tel Aviv. The State Department has habitually downplayed well-evidenced allegations of abuse at the hands of Israeli soldiers, vowing to raise the issue with Tel Aviv while insisting that Israel respects international law. However, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has taken the opposite approach with charges against Palestinians, even when they lack any evidence. Blinken initially described the claims that UNRWA was linked to Hamas as highly, highly credible. America's top diplomat, as well as other senior officials, have amplified other false claims, such as the beheaded babies and October 7th mass rape myths. All right. 2 more articles are. Actually, one last article here. This one from Will Porter at antiwar.com. And, huge thanks to Will and then Connor, who we'll have him back on the show either later this week or early next week, kind of depending how busy things are at antiwar.com today. He'll be back, but they both wrote 2 articles for antiwar.com yesterday. Connor will come on the show to talk about his. But this one from Will: Israel's security chief cheers killing a Palestinian child. Israel's national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has commended a border guard who killed a young Palestinian boy playing in occupied East Jerusalem, describing the 12-year-old child as a terrorist. In his post to his Telegram channel on Tuesday, Ben-Gvir claimed the border officer shot a terrorist who had tried to use fireworks against Israeli forces the night prior, arguing the guard did exactly what was expected to him in executing the unnamed preteen. I salute the soldier who killed the terrorist who tried to shoot fireworks at him and the troops. This is exactly how you should act against terrorists, with determination and precision. Ben-Gvir added in his post. The minister was referring to the fatal shooting of a 12-year-old Palestinian boy, later identified as Rami al Haloui, who was killed as he and other youths played with fireworks in East Jerusalem in a refugee camp earlier this week. Footage of the slaying was circulated online, showing the boy preparing to set off a firework before a gunshot rings out. He is briefly seen falling to the ground before the video ends, and was later brought to a local trauma unit in critical condition, according to hospital staff cited by CNN. He was pronounced dead soon after. While Israeli officials acknowledged the incident and said the officers in the area had been attacked with fireworks and Molotov cocktails in recent days, it is unclear how the small Roman candlelight firework would pose a threat to a heavily armed border troop. A Palestinian journalist later noted that children often set off fireworks as a Ramadan tradition, saying that the young boy was murdered by a vengeful Israeli soldier. And it does seem like this would be a situation where me and my friends did this when we were little kids. We run around the neighborhood with fireworks, especially around the 4th of July. And, we didn't do too much nefarious stuff with them, but I also can't imagine that any of us would have ever been, certainly not gunned down, but unlikely even confronted by a police officer. And so, to have this 12-year-old shot in the head is just absolutely so sick and so disgusting. But it is just a very small example of what is happening to the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, which we talk about all the time on the show, but the Palestinians in the West Bank as well. And that's, they're very cruel treatment. I mean, over 100 kids have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. And so what is happening to them would be an absolute horror that would probably be talked about in detail on every single show if it wasn't for how bad things are right now in Gaza. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. I will have one more show out this week. It'll either be with Connor or it'll be a solo show. And if it's not with Connor, Connor will return early next week. If I do a show with Connor, then that'll be out tomorrow, Friday. Everybody, thank you all so much for tuning into the show. I really appreciate all the support that you guys give me. It's been a pretty busy week here. I've done quite a bit of writing for antiwar.com. So if I'm like missing any of my usual Twitter posts and stuff like that, I've just been extra busy with that stuff. But anyways, I appreciate all of your support, and we'll be back with more shows later in the week.